I need to practice reading aloud for this and other upcoming audiobooks. So I'm going to give you chapter 2 right now as I engrave these bookmarks. Let's go. And here we go. Chapter 2, 1994. The following summer, I graduated from high school and left Maui for a minimum wage tech internship in Seattle. My friend Nick Jensen, who'd graduated the year before, was transferring from USC to the University of Washington to live near his grandfather, and had suggested we take a road trip on the way north in a roundabout fashion and visit the Grand Canyon. Only knowing of one place in the southwest, I insisted we add Mogollon to our itinerary. And so we headed east from Los Angeles, making the trip in 2 days and 1 night in my grandparents' borrowed Buick Century, whose ever-dependable radiator overheated halfway up Bursum Road once again. We stopped at the Tilted Windmill to obtain a house key, and Kinney invited us over for dinner. At my parents' house, I proudly demonstrated how to turn on the well pump and water heater, let Nick marvel at the actual hand pump in the kitchen, and sat down to show off the range of the satellite dish. But Nick insisted we hadn't driven this far to sit in front of a television. So we walked the length of the town as tourists do, marveling at the rusting mine cars and the blocked-off doorways into the stone mountainside, the original cold storage system. During its heyday, enterprising residents would saw frozen ice from further up the mountain into blocks and bring it to town to sell. Covered in sawdust and stored in the mountain caves, it kept produce cool all summer. 2 businesses were open this year in addition to the old theater store. The novelty shop sold birdhouses and model airplanes. Nick tried to engage the owners, 2 frail men in button-down sweaters, in small talk, but all he got were grunts and shrugs. In the middle of the hot summer day, smoke poured from the chimney of a small house surrounded by a yard full of figurines and art sculptures and partially chopped logs. A sign read, "Mogollon's mesmerizing mystical mirror. Hypnotism and readings, $5. While we stared, a woman emerged from the house to gather an armful of firewood. She must have been in her 60s. She wore a bikini top and a flowing sarong around her waist and Birkenstocks. When she saw us staring, she smiled. "The house is cold," she explained. "I keep the fire going so I don't have to wear clothes." I showed Nick the 1968 International Harvester that Robert Maldonado had left behind with the house. Not that different from the rusting relics that decorated the town, but supposedly still able to make it from one end to the other. I showed him where Denny and I had fought the rattlesnake. We found openings into the mountain, some with train tracks and others clearly ventilation shafts for the miners. These tended to be vertical and partially hidden by the slope. As alluring as these gaping pits into the very center of the earth were, I'd read enough Tom Sawyer to quell the temptation to venture inside. Anyway, Nick wanted to climb. Just to the west of town stood a modest-sized peak, boasting an impressive rock outcropping. The view of town would be superb from its vantage point. By the time we reached the top, it was late afternoon, and storm clouds had rolled down the mountain to obscure our Kodak moment. We could still see the town, though. Kinney was standing in his yard waving at us. We stood on the very top of the outcropping and raised our arms to wave back. Then a lightning bolt flashed among the clouds and a crack of thunder split the sky. The spell broke. We looked at each other, simultaneously realizing that Kinney was waving us off the mountaintop. That night, Reese regaled us with local gossip while Kinney nodded stoically at her soliloquy, inserting clarifying details when the opportunity presented itself. Reese was a fire spotter. Born and raised some 70 miles away in Silver City, she'd earned a forestry degree at Western New Mexico University and parlayed that into a job as one of Bear Wallow's fire lookouts. 2 weeks alone on top of a mountain and 2 weeks off from mid-April through October, with unemployment over the winter. It wasn't a bad gig. She'd been doing it nearly 20 years now. Kinney ran the tavern during tourist season, approximately the same months. He was as stoic as she was gregarious, polar opposite personalities seemingly ill-suited for their jobs, but possibly having developed because of them. Kinney, a.k.a. Kindred Spirit, an imposing man with a long braid in his sun-bleached hair, had moved to Mogollon in the early 1980s as part of a wave of hippies seeking to build the utopia they'd envisioned during their long, strange trips on the magical mystery tour. They were in a bit of a feud with a neighbor. Kinney liked to play NPR while he worked about his yard, but the neighbor must have disagreed with his political alignment. He'd mounted a radio antenna halfway up the canyon wall and broadcast recordings of Art Bell at a very similar frequency. The interference made NPR unlistenable. As this wasn't their first clash, Kinney didn't bother trying to reason with him. Instead, he called the FCC and reported it. The pirate station was shut down within a week. Another time, Reese had forgotten her keys in the door of her car. She went out to retrieve them to discover the neighbor had laid possession to the keyring, was in fact swinging it in his fingers and gloating as she passed by. When she demanded the keys back, he went into his house and locked the door. So she called the county sheriff, who made the hour-plus drive up to town, and they confronted the neighbor. He immediately handed the keyring over to the sheriff. Every single key had been ground flat. They were all useless. When asked why he'd destroyed the keys, the neighbor said he didn't want to be accused of having used them to steal things. "It takes all kinds," Reese said, laughing at her own story. One day a stranger in a cowboy hat came into the tavern, looked around, and announced that he owned the property. Mike Kinney just stared him down and calmly said, "Okay." Eventually the man left. Then he walked into the novelty shop and did the same thing. The brother working the counter made the mistake of arguing. The stranger said he had documents to prove his claim. The brother threatened to take him to court. The stranger agreed. They would meet at sunrise 3 weeks hence, armed with lawyers and supporting evidence. It was a modern-day duel. Reese laughed again. Some months later, that same stranger came back to the tavern, rubbing his hands in glee. He'd lost the case, of course, but it cost the defendant over $7,000 in legal fees. "Some people just want to fight," Kinney observed stoically. Nick and I found ourselves in one the very next day. It started when I suggested we take the day to recuperate before doing more driving. It was 10 in the morning, and I'd gotten as far as making a bowl of oatmeal and sitting down to eat it. He'd washed and dressed and packed his bags and was sitting across from me, arms folded, one leg impatiently rocking on the creaky old floor. "I swear, Fred," he said, "you're the laziest traveler I've ever met. Here we are on the edge of the Gila wilderness. We could go to the Cliff Dwellings or the Catwalk Park or drive up the mountain to Willow Lake. There's any number of tourist attractions available, and you just want to sit here." "We're in the middle of an attraction," I pointed out. "You don't even want to go for a hike?" I shrugged. "I don't really like hiking. I do like being in places you have to hike to get to, but here all it takes is going out to the porch and the view's just as good." Nick bunched up his face muscles in disdain. "Guess I shouldn't be surprised. You were like this in high school. You never commit to anything. You just kind of exist on the periphery." "Hell are you talking about?" I growled, but the words struck deep. I'd floated through every school assignment I'd been given, always doing the minimum necessary to keep my teachers happy. I'd never joined extracurricular activities. It was one path of least resistance after another, even the decision to abandon college for a low-paying entry-level position, a decision whose unintended side effect had led to the purchase of the house we were sitting in now. Maybe that was why I'd insisted we come, and was hesitant to leave now that we'd arrived. In some odd karmic way, my lack of commitment had led me here, and perhaps it had more to say. "This place is fascinating," Nick was saying. "There's so much history to learn. How'd it get its name? Who found gold in the first place? How'd they build the road, for God's sake? If you're not up for anything, I'll walk around and try to talk to people, learn what I can, but you're the one with the house here." "Fine," I said, sighing in exaggerated exasperation. "We'll go for a hike." Above town the road forked, right to Willow Lake and left to the Fanny Hill Mine and the town cemetery. "That's more like it," Nick crowed. "No better place to learn about a town than its cemetery." The road wound up the north side of the canyon in a series of switchbacks, providing a bird's-eye view of the town, the summer sun stretching nearly into the creek itself. We passed several houses as well as decaying cabins, sun-scorched structures of old growth and corrugated roofing, before the road angled up a creek bed and beyond house and home. Still, here was evidence of mining, holes in the side of the canyon, rock-walled terraces, mangled metal remains. How many people live here, Nick wondered. We came to another fork, left to the mine, right to the cemetery. We kept walking. The cemetery was marked with a token fence that may have kept out cattle, but deer and other forest fauna had clearly not been deterred. Neither had the pervasive cacti undergrowth, nor the juniper and pinyon trees that blanketed the area. In short, the cemetery was entirely overgrown to the point of not being a cemetery so much as a part of the forest that happened to have gravestones dispersed at random amongst the trees. It was so large that, once you passed through the wrought iron gate, you immediately forgot you were fenced into a specific part of the landscape. And the gravestones. Here was an entire family. Here were influenza babies. Here lay but few older than 50 years of age, and even fewer more recent. Some were no more than metal crosses stuck in the ground. A few were fenced in their own right, tomb-sized stones engraved with poems or scripture. Everything was very Catholic. There was no Maldonado to be found, nor Mogollon. So much for learning about the town. Nick shot me a look. I learned a lot. To have a cemetery this big, the town must have been a couple thousand people at least, mostly late 1800s to the 1940s. Do you notice anything about the names? I turned away, ostensibly to look at names on gravestones, but when it was safe I scowled. What was he seeing that I'd missed? No Asian names, Nick said, only Hispanic and Anglo. You don't think there were Asians here? I asked, my back still to him. Not buried here. I didn't get it. I turned to demand an explanation. Hey! A horn honked, causing me to jump. Give a guy a hand? Nick and I turned toward the sound. On the other side of the fence, in the middle of the road we'd walked up, an aging jeep idled. An old man leaned out the window holding a bouquet of flowers. I'm no spring chicken anymore, the man explained as we walked over. He was bald, with several dark spots on his scalp. He wore a pair of horn-rimmed glasses and a hearing aid. The jeep, which sputtered out fumes as we spoke, had a hard shell patched with duct tape and a matte black paint job under several years' worth of mountain dust. It's my wife's birthday. What's her name? Nick said, gesturing at the flowers. We'd be honored to deliver those. Thelma Rosier, the man said, handing over the bouquet. She's up near the top of the lot, and I thank you kindly. It's no problem, said Nick. Come on. I followed him back into the cemetery. We found her gravestone easily. It was indeed near the top of the lot, one of several Rosiers buried in a row, and next to Thelma's was an empty spot. I shivered as Nick laid the flowers next to her grave. Weird to know where your body's ending up. He gave me an exasperated look. Come on, let's catch a ride down the hill. Now you're talking my language. Nick just shook his head. Then he shook down Mr. Rosier for all the information he could get out of him. The town of Mogollon was named after Juan Ignacio Flores Mogollon, an official in the Spanish army and the 36th governor of New Mexico from 1712 to 1715. Mr. Rosier spat out the window. He was removed from office for embezzlement, and yet he gets a town, a mountain range, an entire prehistoric people named after him? So the town wasn't here in the 1700s? Nick asked. No, Mr. Rosier said. Not until the late 1800s, after James Cooney found gold. There was a town named after him. Ha! He spat out the window again. Apaches did for Cooney and a flood did for his town. It never got built up again, though. Wait, Mogollon flooded? Flooded, burnt, flu epidemic? What hasn't happened here? You weren't alive then, though. No? Mr. Rosier laughed, a grating sound. Kid, I remember the first carriage to drive into this town without a horse in front of it. I remember when they were hauling so much silver out of here it had to be guarded by an entire regiment. And I remember the day it ended. The look that crossed his face was less melancholy than confused. June 18th, 1942. The mine shut down, and overnight it seemed everybody moved on. Thousands of people off to mines in Clifton or Morenci or Douglas, or back east or wherever they came from in the first place. But some of us were born here. Did Asian people live here? Nick asked, glancing my way. Orientals? Rosier said. Sure, they were here. Hard workers. They had their own cat house and everything up Coffee Gulch. Why aren't any in the graveyard? Not Christian, Rosier said, shaking his head. He spat out the window. Shouldn't matter, you ask me. My parents bought Hazel Maldonado's house, I said, seeing a chance to contribute to the conversation. Ah, Hollywood Hazel, Mr. Rosier sighed. She was too big for this town. I loved her, you know, but then everybody did. Still, if she hadn't come back with that rancher, I would have married her first chance I got. You didn't get along with Robert? He was fine, Mr. Rosier waved it off. Never quite found his place here, though. Can't raise cattle in the mountains. He got fired from the Forest Service, from the Postal Service, from the Department of Transportation. They mostly lived on her acting money. She ran a gallery for a while in the 60s. What did you do, Mr. Rosier? Nick asked politely. Lenny, call me Lenny. I did ham radio, and I've never stopped doing it. I'm sorry, said Nick, chagrined. He looked out the window meaningfully. We were nearing the bottom of the canyon. But there can't be much line of sight out here, can there? Lenny frowned. You never heard of repeaters? The moon bounce? Kid, there's stuff out here you've never dreamed of, things you'll never learn about in your fancy universities. I've seen purple lights float through this valley at night, unearthly purple lights that moved in ways lights shouldn't move. I've heard voices bouncing off the moon that weren't from this planet, non-human voices, other things too. Well, it looks like this is our stop, Nick said. Thanks for the ride. Lenny Rosier pulled over and let us out. My cabin's up the road a ways. Stop by for coffee sometime. I don't get out much anymore. The moment he drove off, Nick and I turned on each other. What was that? I said. You pump him for information and then shut him up the moment you don't like what you're hearing? Darn right, Nick exclaimed. I don't like what I'm hearing now. That guy was clearly daft. We can't trust anything he said. Your problem is you only see how things are useful to yourself. Your problem is you don't know what is. That doesn't even make sense. It's what I've been saying all along, Nick pressed. You don't commit to anything because you don't know what matters to you. You're just out here LARPing through life. I bit off my retort. Nothing I could think to say would make things better, or change the fact that he was right. Look, he said, his voice a tone calmer. That guy just gave us a treasure trove of information about this town. You're the one with the house here. If I were you, I'd write it down. You never know what might be useful. I shrugged him off. My memory was good. Besides, hadn't he just said we couldn't trust Lenny? Didn't you say he was daft? Well, sure, Nick grinned. But it makes a good story.